Hello, my sweet friends. So I'm a popsicle today. So I've got my big fuzzy blanket. I have Bud Not Buddy. We're going to be reading chapter 19. I am, however, going to split this chapter into two parts. It's kind of longer, and I've made longer recordings before and uploaded them successfully to YouTube, but YouTube has been a little bizarre with me lately, and I don't know if it's just been a fluke or what. But last week, oh my gosh, the problems I was having getting anything uploaded, it was a whole thing. So I'm going to try an experiment, and I'm going to, even though like it's a longer chapter, but it's not that long, but I'm still going to just divide it into two small parts, hoping that it's going to make the uploading process go a little easier. We will see. Who knows? But I'm going to read from the beginning of chapter 19 and then to page 222. And then I'm going to cut the video off there. And then part 2 will pick right up where I left off on page 222. And then we'll read the rest of the way through the chapter. I can't believe we're already on the final chapter of Bud Not Buddy. It's crazy to me. How are we already here? But sometimes really great books come to an end, and that's okay, right? So I hope you enjoy chapter 19. Here we go. Man, ever since he heard me call my mama's name, Herman Calloway had locked himself up in his room and wouldn't come out. Mr. Jimmy and Miss Thomas made me sit at the kitchen table whilst they knocked on his door and tried to talk him into opening it up, but the way they kept saying, Herman, soft at first, then louder and louder, it sounded like he wasn't talking back. After the longest while, they decided to let the big baby have his own way and came back downstairs, and they sat at the table with me. Miss Thomas looked at me and said, my. Mr. Jimmy said, now look here, Bud. He wiped his hand over his face. You're sure your mama's name was Angela Janet? I said, yes, sir. And the two of you both had the same last name. Her last name was Caldwell, too. She never said nothing about being no Calloway. I spelt it out for him. No, sir. Her name was Caldwell. Caldwell. It seemed like he finally believed me, and he said, okay. I hope you don't mind me asking, Bud, but it's pretty important that we know. How'd your mama pass, and how long ago was it? Pass was just like gone. It was another one of those words grown folks use instead of dead. I said, I was 6 years old when it happened, sir. I don't know why. She was too sick to go to work for 6 days in a row. And then one morning I went into her room and she was dead. But she didn't suffer or nothing. It happened real quick. She didn't even have time to close her eyes. She didn't look like it hurt or nothing. Miss Thomas reached across the table and touched my arm. She said, I'm sure it didn't, Bud. I'm sure it was very peaceful for her. Mr. Jimmy said, when she was living, Bud, God rest her soul, what'd your mama look like? This was another strange question. But before I could answer, Miss Thomas said, James, what are you insinuating? Insinuating means, what are you getting at? What are you trying to say by the words that you're saying right now? I knew there was something familiar about this boy. I don't know how I missed it before, but look at Bud's eyes. You have to ask if this is Herman's grandchild? Mr. Jimmy said, now hold on, Grace. I'm just trying to ask the questions that I know Herman would ask if he could. Ain't a thing wrong with being certain before we jump to any conclusions. Now, what'd she look like, son? I said, she was real pretty, sir. Mr. Jimmy said, oh, I bet she was. But that ain't what I meant. Was she short or tall? Was she slim or big-boned? I said, I don't know, sir. She was real pretty and real tall and kind of skinny like me, I guess. Miss Thomas said, James, Bud was 6 years old. Everyone on earth was real tall to him. I don't see what all the point is. I said, pardon me, ma'am. I know how I can show you what she looks like. I still got her picture. They just stared at me. I said, can I be excused? Miss Thomas said, yes, son. Hurry up and go get that picture. I busted up the stairs, but stopped like I hit a brick wall. I remember how mad and crazy Herman Calloway looked when he yelled at me, so I tippy-toed up the rest of the way of the stairs. Uh-oh. Herman Calloway's door was open just a crack. I I held my breath and tiptoed extra quiet and extra fast right into the little dead girl's room. And as soon as I did, whoop, zoop, sloop, my heart jumped up into my stomach. Hermione Calloway was sitting on the little chair in front of the little mirror on the dressing table. His elbows were on the table and his face was covered by his hands, and it sounded like he was having trouble breathing because every time he sucked in a bunch of air, he made a sound like and every time he blew air out, he made a sound like Have you ever made noises like that when you're really, really upset and you're crying harder than maybe you've ever cried before? I know sometimes I make blubbering noises when I cry, and Hermione Calloway is very shook up by something, and he's very, very sad right now. I didn't know what to do. I could tell Mr. C didn't know I was in the room with him, so I could probably just backward tiptoe and get out of there without anything happening. I rose up on my toes, took 2 baby steps back, and stopped. Shucks. I'd come up here to show Miss Thomas and Mr. Jimmy what my mama looked like. There wasn't nothing wrong with that. I wasn't doing nothing... I wasn't doing nothing that meant I had to sneak out of the room on my tiptoes going backwards. I sucked in a mouthful of air and walked over to my bed. I picked up my sax case and set it on top of the bed. I pushed the 2 silver buttons to the side, and the other 2 silver tongues jumped open and made those loud click, click sounds. Hermione Calloway still didn't take his face out of his hands. He kept going. I reached inside my sax case and took out the envelope with Mama's picture in it, and I closed the 2 silver tongues again and could tell that Mr. C wasn't paying me no mind at all. He kept his face in his hands, and his head was rocking up and down real slow, sort of like he was checking to see how much it weighed. You know, I know he was very grumpy to Bud, but I do feel very bad for him right now. He's clearly really hurting, and it's always really hard to see people cry. I put my sax case back next to the bed. I was about to leave the room when I looked over at Hermione Calloway's back. He still didn't know I was in the room with him. I looked in the little round mirror and still couldn't see his face. But I could see his hands were a lot better. I could see 6 little trails of water coming out from where his fingers joined up with his hands. The 3 trails from each hand joined up together on his wrists and ran down his arms, puddling on top of the dressing table. Shucks. Hermione Calloway was bawling his eyes out. He was acting like me being his grandson was the worst news anyone could ever give you in your life. This was number 39 of Bud Caldwell's Rules and Things to Have a Funner Life and Make a Better Liar Out of Yourself. Rules and Things number 39. The older you get, the worse something has to be to make you cry. With babies, it's easy not to pay them no mind because crying's just like talking for a baby. A baby's tears might mean, hey, you just stuck a pin in my behind when you changed my diapers. Or their crying might be the way they picked out to say, good morning, Mama. What are we going to do today? And that makes it easy not to care too much about baby's tears. So says Bud. When you got an old person crying, you got a whole nother story. When you got someone as old as Hermione Calloway crying, you better look around because you know you're square in the middle of one of those boiling tragedies. You can't help but feel sorry for him. Even if he's been mean to you from the minute he first laid eyes on you, even if he's crying because he found out the 2 of you were kin. Remember, kin means family. And speaking of family, Mr. Calloway, like we said, as grumpy and unkind to Bud as he was, is very upset. And do we think it's just because he found out Bud's his grandson? Or do we think maybe it's because he not only found out he has a grandson, he not only found out that this boy, his grandson, his mother is his daughter, obviously, but also that his daughter has died and he didn't even know, right? So he's feeling a lot of things because he just learned a lot of new, heavy, kind of heart-achy information all in one go. And so that's got to be hard for him. I walked over to Hermione Calloway, and before I could think, my hand moved toward his back. I waited for one of those spaces between the and the and then I touched him. His skin under his shirt was very, very warm. It took a second for Hermione Calloway to know someone was touching him, and when he knew, I felt his skin jerk and twitch the same way a horse's does when a fly lands on it. He whipped his head around, and when he saw it was me, he jerked away, took one more giant and then stared. His mouth started moving like he was talking in a secret language that only dogs could hear. At last, real American words started coming out of his mouth, and he said, how, I'm so, look, Buddy, I just, it's Bud, sir, not Buddy. He put his face back in his hands and broke down all over again. Man, it's a good thing the thug wasn't around, because if he'd heard the way Mr. C was weeping, no one would have wondered who the real Waterworks Willie was. I put my hand back on Mr. C's shoulder and patted him and rubbed him a couple of times and then left the room. It felt a lot better going out frontwards instead of sneaking out backwards. I ran down the steps back into the kitchen. Miss Thomas's and Mr. Jimmy's eyes jumped right out onto the envelope. I set it in the middle of the table. Both of them just looked at it before Miss Thomas reached out and picked it up. She went into the pocket of her dress and took some funny little glasses that only had the bottom half to them and then put them on her nose. She pulled Mama's picture out and held it as far away from her eyes as her arms would stretch, looking like that. Have you ever done that? She looked at the picture, looking over her glasses at me, and then looked right at Mr. Jimmy, and then said, "Any more questions for this young man?" She slid the picture over to him. Mr. Jimmy picked it up and said, "Well, I'll be. Remember that old con man who used to drag that ruined horse through town? Now, what was his name? Help me out here, Grace. Didn't he call his act Joey Pegas and his brokeback bucking bronco?" Miss Thomas said, "It was Joey Pegas and his brokeback bucking bronco, James. But what else do you see in the picture?" Mr. Jimmy said, Yep, that's definitely Angela Janet Calloway." He looked at me and said, "You sure this is your mother?" I said, "Yes, sir. But her name's Caldwell, not Calloway." He said, "Well, I'll just be." Miss Thomas butted in on him. "There's little doubt about that, James, but we've got to do." She kept on talking, but I quit listening, because something just came out of the blue and gave me a good whoop right on the forehead. Without even thinking about what I was doing, I butted in on Miss Thomas and I said, "That means that's not some little dead girl's room I'm sleeping in. That's my mama's room?" She kind of looked at me surprised, like this was the first time she'd thought of that too. She said, "Well, that's right, Bud. You're back in your mama's room." I said, "How come Herman Calloway never called on me and my mother? All he'd have to do was call on us one time. I know she wouldn't have been so mad." Well, Miss Thomas and Mr. Jimmy took turns shooting quick looks at each other, and then she said, "Bud, give me your hand." Uh-oh. Pretty soon I'd have to come up with rules and things about when Miss Thomas holds your hand. She stretched her arm across the table, and I held on to her fingers. "Bud," she said, "your granddad didn't know anything about you. No one knew where your mother had gone." So that is right here on page 222. We are going to pick up, like I said, with this second recording, finishing up that last paragraph on page 222 and then continuing through to the end. So, hope you're enjoying it so far. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 more pages left. Oh my goodness. Bye, guys.